Basic Education, Angie Motshekga held an urgent infrastructure meeting which included the Council of Education ministers, all the provincial MECs, heads of the department and officials that are responsible in various provinces. She committed that the department will provide a detailed audit of sanitation facilities with a budgeted emergency plan as well as timelines to address this challenge. It was also resolved that where sanitation infrastructure have been provided, pit toilets will be demolished. Equal Education Parliamentary officer and researcher Sibabalwe Gcilitshana joins us live from our studios in Sea Point this morning to take this discussion further. Sibabalwe, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me.
Now, we know that Equal Education has, over the years, demanded the infrastructure plan from the Department of Basic Education to address this sanitation problem. Are you accepting what the department had to put forward yesterday?
Well, firstly, I think what is important to address is that we actually have a law in place already in the country that speaks about the minimum norms and standards for school infrastructure. And in this, it sets out a blueprint of how the Department of Basic Education is going to, with deadlines that they've set for themselves, eradicate, schools made of inappropriate infrastructure, electrify schools and give them proper sanitation, as well as other facilities such as libraries and labs. This law was promulgated in 2013, and so there already is a baseline. It's just that the minister has failed to mention that this law exists, even when she released her statement after the CEM meeting, which they met on yesterday very urgently, is that there is a baseline that we need to be working against. And in fact, the department missed its first deadline on the 29th of November 2016. So, while the concern by the president and the directive that he has instructed the minister to take up on is that it's good, but we have something to work with already, and rather that is what we should be focusing on, making sure that the minimum norms and standards are being met, as opposed to making another directive that might in fact have unintended consequences, such as undermining the law and the deadlines in which these issues are supposed to be addressed in.
Yeah, and one other thing that also came out of that particular briefing is that the department has also committed to providing detailed audit of sanitation facilities. But if I remember correctly, Equal Education had its own report that indicated that there are about 4,358 schools that still have pit toilets.
Yes, so that statistic is for the entire country, and we had a social audit of 60 schools in the Eastern Cape where we were looking at what the infrastructure, sanitation, electricity, and whether or not these schools essentially meet the minimum norms and standards. What our research found during the social audit was that, in fact, there were schools that were not complying with the law, and these schools, which we saw as schools that needed infrastructure upgrades, were in fact not on the department's plans to be addressed. And so we see that there's a bit of a disjuncture in what the actual need is on the ground and what the department has decided, or rather set as what they're going to address in this matter. So while we have conducted this social audit and the department is going to conduct its own audit, the question is, why aren't they already aware of what the situation is like at the moment? The minister is extensively briefed and has also carried analyses on what the extent of the problem is like on the ground, and to have to take an urgent matter like this, that they need to be instructed by the president that they need to do a fresh audit, is going beyond what should have already been done. So the fact that we don't know how many schools in the country currently need to be addressed in terms of school infrastructure, pit latrines, and that when Equal Education does additional research, it finds that its information is actually not concurrent with what the department is putting out, is very distressing. So what needs to be done is that even in instances when we have shared our information, we don't know what happens to it. So we'll share our social audit with, government officials and the ministry itself, but there isn't any meaningful engagement that takes place on that. And also we've been calling on the minister to release implementation plans and progress reports in a timeless manner. But again, we see this lag in the information getting out there, which is already so complicated and inaccessible. So, there needs to be better communication from their side.
Yeah. And we've seen many people, of course, reacting to the meeting yesterday, saying that this is not necessarily a new concern. And I know that Equal Education has in the past placed the blame entirely on the Minister of Education, saying that she's not addressing the issue on in the urgency that it all deserves.
That's very true. I mean, for it to take the passing of a learner for the department to address this only shows how they are not dealing with it with the urgency that it needs. I mean, and this is not the first child that we have lost due to inappropriate school infrastructure and sanitation facilities. So how many more learners must we lose before the department really wakes up to realize that it needs to stick to its promises? And the reason we hold the minister accountable is because she is essentially the accounting officer for the entire department. She's the one who promulgated these norms and standards as she is enacted by the South African Schools Act. So she has the power, and it is her responsibility because the functions now lie within her department. But I mean, we were in the Bishop High Court last week fighting against the Fix the Norms case, where we have in fact identified loopholes in the norms and standards law, and we are asking that the minister address these, because this is why we have seen that schools haven't been built at the speed that they need to be. MECs are not being held accountable, and even premiers are failing to hold these provincial heads accountable for failing to do this. So, there's a lot that still needs to be done in this regard.
Yeah, certainly. And we've also seen the department yesterday, of course, indicating that, for instance, the fact that the phenomena of pit latrines have been eliminated, the increased numbers of learners migrating to some provinces is sort of adding pressure to the already existing challenges. Do you share the same sentiments?
So the problem with addressing migration is that it assumes that the department has no competency to plan and coordinate appropriately beforehand. For them to use migration as an excuse for why we still see inappropriate school infrastructure is just not strong enough. There was a deadline that was set by themselves, if we must add. So it's not that there was pressure that schools need to be of a certain caliber, by an external force. No, the department, having used its own resources, its own data, and its own analysis, said that. In fact, we think we are capable of, by the 29th of November 2016, eradicating all schools made out of inappropriate structures, and also making sure that they're electrified, have good sanitation, and access to good water. So to then come back and say, but migration patterns are really making this difficult. The department houses all of these, these different data sources. And so if you've seen it in a previous year, surely you should be planning. And also it's not a one-time thing. It's a continuous process of making sure that you're keeping up to date with what's happening. And so when we're speaking about school rationalization, for instance, where they try to close down one school, or rather close down non-viable schools to merge them and make one proper schools, that means that you need to take into account the fact that learners might be migrating from rural provinces to urban provinces. Also, again, we need to question why learners are feeling, or rather parents are feeling to move their learners. Is the quality of education something that we need to be discussing? And if yes, then the department needs to look into it, because that means if they were to develop and make sure that their quintile 1 to 3 schools are exactly, at the same standard as their quintile 4 to 5 schools, we wouldn't see migration to be such a big problem, because people would be able to send their children to the most nearby schools with the certainty that they're going to receive the exact same quality of educationists that we receive anywhere else.
All right, Sibabalwe, we have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for coming through. Let's wait and see what happens within that particular 3 months deadline that's been set by President Cyril Ramaphosa. Sibabalwe Gcilitshana is Equal Education's Parliamentary Officer and Research, of course, talking to us about the meeting that took place between the Minister of Basic Education yesterday with all stakeholders within the education sector. We're taking a quick